Welcome back, dear listener. This is the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove podcast, episode 448. Got a special one for you today. It's not the usual panel. It's just myself, Trevor, and a special guest. I've got Marc James Léger, who is an author and an academic and a scholar who talks a lot about identity politics and the role of the left in its approach to this and class politics and all that sort of stuff. So Marc has written various books and articles, and he's got a slide presentation, and we're going to really get into the weeds when it comes to identity politics and what's happening in the world today. So Marc, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Trevor. And we're fellow citizens or subjects of the Commonwealth. So
Yes.
that puts us in a kind of grim situation at this moment as we become kind of the axis of evil at this point in history.
The axis of evil in terms of identity politics, or just in terms of Western civilization and the whole...
Yeah, in terms of Western civilization and the role of Canada and the Commonwealth in the world today in terms of imperialism and global capitalism.
Yeah. We've got, our monarch is currently visiting Australia, and I can't believe the number of people who are just falling over themselves to see our king and queen. So that's happening in Australia at the moment. So, yeah. So Marc, before we get into it, do you want to just sort of say in a nutshell your view on what's happened with the left and identity politics, just as an overall sort of statement, if you like, before we get into details, and maybe why you're so interested in this topic, and maybe a little bit of what you've done in terms of writing books and your efforts over the last few years, just a sort of a broad brush before we get into the details?
Sure. As I mentioned to you previously, what I'm going to do today is present a sort of hard-boiled detective version of this presentation, in the sense that, you have the Sherlock Holmes type of detective who's kind of an ivory tower scholar, who's different from the Mike Hammer hard-boiled detective of the film noir genre, where you usually have a working class detective who gets embroiled in a scenario in which he doesn't really know what's happening, but at a certain point, he knows too much, and he gets caught up, often roughed up in the process. And so this is my case. I'm kind of offering a sort of a confessional, or not a confessional, a confidential, in the sense that what I'm talking about in my books and on an abstract level is also something that I've lived through, that I've experienced. So my interest, technically speaking, I'm not interested in identity politics, but I am interested in culture. And of course, if you study contemporary art and art theory, you can't avoid identity politics and identity issues. They're not only the subject matter of much art, but it's also, in terms of how you study art, methodology. It's essential in terms of your education. And because of that, you end up working in departments where people are coming to subjects from a very subjective points of view. So you will be in a department with feminist instructors, feminist students. You have instructors who are gay, who are teaching queer theory. You have instructors who are teaching post-colonial theory, and students who are non-white, who may be indigenous or black or other. And so a lot of these, what we call academic culture wars, have to do a little bit with the people who are creating this knowledge and the students who are going to take courses who are interested in it. And almost inevitably, as in any field, there's competition. And in some cases, the competition could be somewhat intense, let's just say. And political differences can often hinge on very what Freud refers to as the narcissism of minor differences, very small differences when all things are considered, but in theoretical terms, they can become sort of like dividing lines. And so you get this kind of intense, departmental competition. Sometimes it's around new hires. Sometimes it's around visiting scholars. It could be pretty much anything. And in my case, I've been living, and this is difficult to explain because it at a certain point starts to sound like conspiracy theory, or someone with a delusional disorder of some sort. But I will tell you, and I've told other people this, that I've lived a life as the target of a public secret for 26 years. And it's a long time to be the target of a public secret. And what that is you have a small number of people and they decide they're going to sort of give you a hard time, let's say. So you're the odd man out.
Mm-hmm.
What happens with a public secret is that this can spread to other people, and then that can spread to more people. And so you're constantly almost like a Wicker Man, like that 1960s horror film. Mm-hmm. It began in a context in which people are studying postmodern theory. And at that time, there were shows like Survivor, like reality shows like Survivor Island, and these kinds of things on television. And it's the sort of thing that you figure that scholars who are studying these things are not going to enact these kinds of things in their daily life. But that's what happened to me. And so I was placed in a kind of simulation situation. This was said to me directly, right? But, if somebody tells you this and other people behave that way, there's not a lot that you can do. You can cry wolf and you can scream to the heavens, but not much is going to change.
So is this in the art world, you were an outsider because you weren't in conforming to the way of accepted thinking, and the sort of factions voted you off the island? Is that what you're saying?
Basically, yeah. It's not so much that I was voted off the island. I was kept on the island, but I was made the sort of pariah, you could say.
Right.
Or the whipping boy.
Right. Because of your views on what we're about to talk about with identity politics and stuff, is that? Or the approach to postmodernism or whatever in the art world?
Yeah, it could be many things. You'd have to ask the people who started this why. I mean, technically speaking, you don't need a reason. There was a person before me in my program who had been the target of some of this kind of, just gossip and what have you. And then it seems to have transferred to me as he moved out of the program. But what happened is that eventually it spread from one university to another where I was working. After 9/11, I was basically chased out of Rochester, New York. I left my job in New York for the sake of safety, personal safety, me and my ex-wife. And I thought coming to Canada that would stay behind me, but it managed to seep back in. It managed to follow me. And over the years, there's been all kinds of, shenanigans, you could say, around me. And at a certain point, it's a little bit like the Truman Show, if you've seen that film, except there's no one in charge. There's nobody, pulling the strings. It's spread horizontally through social media and what have you. And at a certain point, it became kind of like Breaking Bad. Here we have a person, you can treat him almost like a character in a reality show. What are we going to do with him? What could we make him do? How could we change him in some way? And this became very aggressive, very violent. There was a lot of criminality at a certain point, especially around 2016. After 2016, things just became very nasty. So I don't know what the cause, like in terms of like what the reasoning was for the people who started it. I don't think they know. People don't always have to have a reason to do something that's just, cynical. But over time, I kind of didn't talk about it for a long time because I was hoping it would just go away. But over time, it just gets worse and worse at the point where you can't hold down a job, at the point where your mental health is at stake, at the point where you're being aggressed on the street. I can go to just today to the supermarket and I will experience dozens of microaggressions between my home and the supermarket. So a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of identity politics and wokeism and the excesses, I've experienced this in various ways because my work as a Marxist does interfere with all of this, what you could refer to as postmodern culture. I believe
So the microaggressions are because you're perceived as a crazy Marxist who's out to sort of bring communism about or something. What are they saying? That you're like a pedophile or a crazy communist, or what's the actual?
Well, we'll get to the
thing?
pedophilia. We'll get to the pedophilia in a moment.
Oh,
I don't.
God.
I mean,
I was only sorry. I was only just
that's okay.
some. I wasn't really thinking we're genuinely heading that territory, but like
We'll get
right,
there.
right,
But in Rochester, it could have been anything. It could have been because I'm French Canadian. It could have been because I'm working class. It could
right.
have been because I'm heterosexual. It could have been because I was the only married person in the program. That was odd to people.
Right,
And it could have been just, I think, like just pettiness.
right.
It's a boring town, and people are, working with high-profile scholars, and they feel a little bit like in a rut. So they find some way to have fun at someone's
Okay.
expense, and it fell on me. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
So did that transition you from being a scholar in art to then a scholar in the topics that we're about to get into? Is that sort of
No,
no?
not at
Okay,
all.
right.
And I did a degree in history and then an MA in art history. And this was in the 90s. I was reading a lot of postmodern theory. I had an inclination and an interest in knowing these things because those were the predominant movements in terms of intellectual trends. But also, I have always had an interest in politics, in left politics, and in Marxism in particular. So in that regard, when I was in the program in cultural studies, it was actually a visual and cultural studies program. I was the odd man out to the extent that these ideas are considered passé. These ideas are considered, dead white man kind of material. And I wasn't with the program when it came to getting rid of the Marxist approach. So for me, it was a matter of how to, basically learning what I could, which was courses on Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault, courses in various kinds of identity streams, queer theory. So I was in all of these classes, but I kept a Marxist, you could say, resistance to this knowledge. So it was almost for me something parallel, right? So
Right. Yep.
you would learn what you could, but your investments remained leftist.
Okay.
And I think
I'm conscious I'm going to have to rein you in a little bit, Mark, on some of these things. So just back to the initial one. In a nutshell, you've written some books on, your latest one is Class Struggle and Identity Politics. Prior to that, you edited a book, Identity Trumps Socialism, the Class and Identity Debate After Neoliberalism. So, what's the elevator pitch of the ideas in these books, that when people say, well, what's that about? And you've got 10 floors to tell them. What do you tell them?
right. So as somebody who's doing what's called militant research, engaged scholarship, the question I ask myself, a lot of this has to do with ideas that were there in the 1990s. But what was interesting is in the 90s, you couldn't talk about capitalism. You couldn't use the word capitalism in a class because it had just been pushed so far into the margins. But with in the 2000s, with the 2008 banking crisis, with Occupy Wall Street, and the rise of a number of prominent scholars, including Hart and Negri on the anarchist left, and Slavoj Žižek and Alain Badiou on the communist left, there was a kind of renewal of interest in Marxism. David Harvey did a series of lectures on reading Capital that was online. A lot of people followed this. So people wanted to come back to some of the basics, you could say, and understood that postmodernism had delivered us a kind of deficit in terms of political traction. So there was a shift away from postmodernism. Occupy Wall Street, in a way, kind of encapsulated that moment. And then soon afterwards, the way I understand it, the way I experienced it, there was kind of like a rush back to, well, wait a minute, postmodernism had always been interested in leftism, like let's in some ways not get too far into this, class reductionism. Let's keep the sort of intersectional combination of identity issues and class issues connected. So the question for me, as wokeism, as we sometimes refer to it, developed, and you really saw the excesses of this kind of identity orientation, to what extent does identity politics today affect the left? So what are the, how does it benefit the left? If not, why not? If so, how? And so in order to answer that question, you have to do a lot of historical analysis. Anyone who's talking about these issues, they can go back to, the Enlightenment era, the era of slavery, the entire 19th century. So you can always, in a way, I don't want to say hedge, but you can kind of hedge your conversation with all of this historical material. But if you do it as a Marxist, you would have to do it as a historical materialist, which means in some ways dealing with class struggle. If you do it as a Foucauldian, a discourse theorist, you can, in a way, place identity, let's say race, at the center of your analysis. So that becomes the placeholder around which everything else revolves. So you don't really have to question the term or the concept in some cases. So for me, the discussion is kind of around the question of class struggle and the place of identity in relation to class struggle, histories of class struggle. And it's very easy to see, if you follow the conversation, it's very easy to see that even when the left is discussed, you've discussed the book by Yascha Mounk. It's called The Identity Trap. Even a book like Yascha Mounk's book, which discusses at times, Marxism and some of these issues of dealing with class, they're really pushed to the side. They're really, marginalized. And that causes a lot of problems because on the one hand, it prevents you from understanding postmodernism, which is in a way, the definition of what he's saying is the identity synthesis. These are all postmodern ideas. But you can't understand postmodern ideas if you don't understand the Marxism they were reacting to and in conversation with. And so you have a lot of intermediate stages. So for example, Eurocommunism, the development of Eurocommunism in the post-war period, the impact of World War II, the rise of the counterculture, the student movement, in other words, all of the movements we associate with the new left, they were affinity groups that look a little bit like what we have today, except in the 60s, there was a strong sense of Marxism. There was a strong connection. Red diaper babies had parents who were in communist parties or who had fought, let's say, with the International during World War II. So there was a connection to the macro political left. Through the 70s and 80s, the counterculture became much more conservative. So by the 80s, the counterculture is something like yuppies. They're not hippies.
Is this kind of because stories come out of terrible things that happened in the Soviet Union? So people then went, okay, communism bad because gulags and oppression in the Soviet era. So that kind of put a bad light on on Marxism or communism. They were sort of thrown in as covered by that sort of oppression. And I think maybe a little bit in the sort of 80s with Thatcher and Reagan, a lot of privatisation took place and people cashed in on the sale of public assets, and a lot of people kind of did okay out of that while the commons was sold off. People who bought shares in these utility companies that were privatised and things. So it was kind of a combination, I'm just suggesting, of bad news coming out of Soviet Union about communism and Marxism, and a sort of a relatively prosperous 80s period whereby it was sort of then accepted, well, capitalism and neoliberalism is the only economic sort of way forward, and it's only in recent times, maybe with the financial crisis and what's going on in the world, where there's perhaps a chance to revitalise Marxism or communism, because people are starting to recognise that capitalism has run out of low-hanging fruit and cheap tricks and is really starting to struggle in many places. But what do you think of that?
Well, it's fine, but it's very tight, right? So, what you'd want to do is you'd want to open it up and let it breathe, and you see a lot of elements there that have been really condensed. I mentioned that Munch's book kind of does that. It's kind of a shorthand where Marxism equals a famine in China and a famine in Ukraine, and then that's kind of like the black book of communism. If you're anti-communist, that'll suit you fine. But if you're Marxist and if you're communist, well, that story is more complicated. But what I'm really interested in is how it is that the left itself, right, in developed countries, which isn't the case everywhere, but how the left itself in developed countries abandoned that project, how it turned away from class very deliberately, labor parties, New Democrats, but also communists, Euro-communists, how they turned away from the basic insights of Marxism, and they ceased to be revolutionary parties. They ceased to be committed to Marxism, except in name. So that's kind of that's sort of what interests me.
Yep.
The cultural aspects of this at the same time, the development of identity politics, and that would include for me things like ecology. It would include new age kind of movements. It doesn't have to be strictly identitarian, but they're basically single issue approaches to politics.
So why did the left shift from class to identity?
Well, one question that interests me is that today, when you talk about class, maybe not so much now, but at least 15, 20 years ago, there was this kind of prevalent idea that we live in a classless society. And this goes back to the 1970s. Or even the 60s. That was one explanation for this that I like, that I'm interested in, but I differ on certain points, is a person called Barbara Ehrenreich, who wrote a book called Fear of Falling. And in the 1970s, her and her husband, John Ehrenreich, at that time her husband, co-authored an essay called The Professional Managerial Class. So they invented a term to describe a way of thinking about the middle class, the professional class. And it's not something that was invented in the 60s. It goes back to the turn of the century. So professionalism and the professional class really develops around 1900. So it's the managerial class, and it's basically, a class that you can distinguish from the majority of working people, as well as the majority of upper class owners of the means of production, basically the capitalist and the bourgeois class. And they're in the middle. They're about 20% of the population. And so from a strict Marxist point of view, the middle class is working class because they don't own the means of production. They're employees, even though they're salaried employees, so they have more income than most working people. And they also do work that is a little bit less tedious, a little bit less repetitive, requires more education, more cultural background, and these kinds of things, which makes it so that the middle class often doesn't identify as working class. They rather aspire to being part of the bourgeoisie. So their sense of culture is bourgeois, and they basically come up with a lot of different ways to distinguish themselves from regular working people. And so Barbara Ehrenreich wanted to answer the question, how is it that the PMC, the professional managerial class, went from being relatively and largely progressive in the 1960s to hyper-conservative in the 1980s? So that's an interesting question that we could get into further, but I think that's part of the answer. But there were obviously structural developments that made the professional class change in some ways with regard to the question of this broader universalism, a broader sense of their mission and service is not to themselves as a class, but rather to society as a whole. And so that's one thing that shifted. The PMC became more of a class for itself in that time period. And so that's where we get this kind of sense of like being managed by a technocratic class that's post-representational, post-political. They no longer stand for politics because they no longer stand for things that are universal. And in that sense, they've abandoned the ideals of the Enlightenment, but in a paradoxical, in a strange way, they've reproduced the Enlightenment, because whereas after Enlightenment, you no longer had a feudal monarchy. You only had two classes, first and second class, right? In some places, you go to England in some places and you see buildings from 1900 and there's two entrances and it says, first class entrance, second class. And, this was part of also the Marxist language, right? Marxism defined everything in this two-class proletariat bourgeoisie. So with the rise to what I would say predominance of the middle class, the petty bourgeoisie, in the post-war period, because of the disasters of World War II, of disasters of Stalinism, disasters of fascism, a lot of young people who were from the middle class, they turned against the middle class because they didn't want to work for capitalism. They didn't want to work for the man, in the 60s sense. And so they were criticizing their class, but as members of that class, right? Not necessarily as communists. And so this is kind of like an internal revolution within trying to change society by changing lifestyle, by changing, what you're going to do on the weekend, not in terms of organizing in a mass movement. So it was this kind of like almost sort of like hippie dream kind of idea of a utopia, right? And so at that point, a lot of political parties are thinking in the same way. They're thinking, how do we address, people who don't want to work in a factory, people who would prefer to have more leisure time, who are conditioned to a great extent by consumer culture. They're influenced by rock music. They're influenced by drugs. They don't want the lifestyle of their parents. They don't want the Protestant work ethic. They don't want the Puritanism. And so there's a sexual revolution. There's the feminist revolution. And so parties start to realign or redefine how they think of their constituencies. So we have the point today where the Democratic Party does not have a vision for politics except for the donor class, which is kind of behind everything. But on the front, there's no vision for society. It's just all of this piecemeal, fragmented, identitarian virtue signaling to different groups as they come along. So it's not only the left that has abandoned universalism. Neoliberalism as such has abandoned universalism.
So there was a period where there was a professional managerial class that did have its eye on the community overall and a class-based sort of approach to things that changed. So there was one at one point. You're saying sort of in the first half of the 1900s, and
well,
that
let's
it
say
changed sort
in
of
the 60s. In the 60s, this is from the 60s to the 80s. You can see this shift, And of
Right.
course, the revelations of Stalinist crimes in the 1940s played a huge part on an intellectual level, but
Yeah.
on a broad mass level, let's say for the middle class, there was a sense. I mean, Ehrenreich makes a great deal of the 1968 Democratic Party National Democratic Party convention in Chicago, where Mayor Daley, brought out the police and beat up all the protesters. Kind of what's happening now with the students who are protesting the genocide in Gaza. And what she argues is that the media discovered that a lot of the silent majority, middle America, working class Americans, were not on board with this student rebellion, that they didn't approve of it necessarily. And so there was this kind of like reflection, well, how did we get that wrong? How did we were all in with the students, but the rest of America doesn't support them. So, what did we miss? And so then there was this kind of investment in the idea of the working man, the blue collar working class male. So what she's arguing is some of this is a projection, right? So it became kind of convenient to think that the working class is not with this new left tendency, when in actuality, it was more than the journalists and the reporters and the media realized or cared to know. But it provided a convenient explanation. And so then you get the creation of television characters like Archie Bunker in All in the Family. And you get this stereotype of the working class, the blue collar working class, as being sexist, racist, homophobic, xenophobic, and not really with, not sort of a Philistine, not cosmopolitan. And this served the conservatives, the neoconservatives who were coming into being at that time, because it said that here we have a base for our conservative politics. Even though they misrecognized that base, even though to a great extent they created it, it was useful. And we saw the same thing repeat itself in 2016 when Trump got elected. For many years, articles in the Atlantic or the Nation or whatever it was, the New York Times, the Washington Post, were talking about this kind of racist working class, so kind of a scapegoat character. And the parallel to that was that the liberal class is an elite, corrupt class that is mostly self-interested. They're not oriented towards, what you can do for your country. In fact, they just think about themselves. And so it was creating this target, the liberal elite, that served the new right, which was a political phenomenon that attached itself to the neoconservative intellectuals. And the new right did something that the conservatives hadn't done previously. Previously, the conservatives were running on policies like small government, less taxes, less foreign involvement, the typical kind of like conservative policies, business interests, cut government spending on social programs and welfare and these kinds of policies. But what the new right added to this conservative tradition, let's say, is a whole host of cultural points, of cultural issues. So you would add to that family values, traditional values, hard work. And so, the working man represented this kind of like hard work ideal that is shared between the capitalist and the average person, that's not shared ostensibly by the hippies and the new left and the liberal elites, the cappuccino slurping yuppies and those people. Well, maybe not yuppies, actually, because the yuppies were the result of all this. Religious values, traditional marriage arrangements, all these kinds of patriotism, all these kind of cultural points that you can attach to traditional conservative policy points that were not necessarily previously popular with working class people. And that was kind of a construction. It was a gambit. It was like, let's go with this, see how far we can take this, and if they'll take the bait, basically. And so with that, you have then the makings for the response, which we're dealing with now in terms of the quote unquote postmodern left. The postmodern left reacts to all of these points, right, against all of this family values, like, let's go back to women in the home, gays in the closet, racism, xenophobia. So it reacts to this in a way that's kind of tailor-made as an analog, as an opposition. And when you end up with this kind of culture war material, which was hugely popular in the 1980s and 90s, if you look at culture in the 80s, it's all culture war, left and right. And so then you get into this kind of like bipartisan situation that we have today with the neoliberals, seemingly progressive. So you can have extremely conservative liberals or Democrats who are progressive on social issues, but on everything else, they're basically imposing neoliberal, neoconservative, not even neoliberal, but neocon think tank policies.
Yeah, on economic matters and foreign policy, there's not a lot between them, both parties.
Exactly, yeah.
And the same here in Australia, and no doubt. And yes, the differences are in the bedroom issues these days, social issues. Yeah. You mentioned that there was...
bedroom issues, integration. We talk about racial integration. Should we have sexual integration? Should we eliminate the boundary between heterosexuality and homosexuality, as some queer radicals would advocate?
You mentioned earlier that it was in the interests of the professional managerial class to shift in this direction. But if in the 60s, 70s, they were still at that point white, well-educated, heterosexual mostly, what was it? Was it a selfish thing for them to want to broaden acceptance of other races and other gender identities and other sexual preferences and things?
Of course not.
Yeah.
When the communists came to power in the Soviet Union in 1917, they legalized sodomy. They made divorce on demand possible. They made abortion available on demand. They passed laws against racism. So a lot of these issues that we associate with the 60s are much older. So what happens in the post-war period that isn't the same as previously is the civil rights tradition, let's say from the 50s, the Black civil rights tradition, is organically connected to the labor movement. And much anti-racism in the United States in the first half of the 20th century was oriented towards communist parties, supported by communist parties, with all kinds of like difficulties and tensions. I'm not saying it was an easy connection, but it existed as such. So if you were anti-racist in the 30s, a person might call you a communist, for example, because the two things were associated and well understood. And with fascism, of course, this kind of racism, this kind of discrimination becomes, anathema for liberal democracies, even though it persists, right, with Jim Crow, for example. But from my perspective, what really changes in the post-war period from the previous is that in the 1920s and 30s, let's say, there was a strong sense, if you were working class, there was a strong sense that you belonged to that class and that you didn't belong with the well-to-do. You were on the wrong side of the tracks. You understood that and you fought from that side.
Can I just interrupt? My father was very working class, and my siblings and I do not have middle names because my father considered we were working class stock and middle names were for rich upper class people. So that was his identity, that we were working class, and that was one of the identifiers of the working class was to not have a middle name. But I digress.
You're the iron fist, right?
Yes.
And so the other fist is the velvet glove?
Yeah, Scott is the velvet glove, yes.
Yeah, okay. But you're one body, no?
In terms of the name of the podcast, is that what you mean?
I'm just... I have a middle name because I went to a high school where there were 5 Marc Légers.
Right. Yep.
So there was Marc. So we needed to distinguish ourselves in one way. So there was Marc Paul Léger. There was Marc, myself, James, also known as Jimmy and Jim Bob.
Yep.
Marc Beans, Marc Jaime, who's a tall guy with black hair, who's named after a character on the TV show.
Yep. Max
Get
Smart.
Smart.
Yep.
And then there was this other guy called Marc Léger, who didn't have, nobody used a middle name for him. He just kind of was nondescript.
Right.
And so, like, he's probably on a beach in Florida somewhere today, taking it easy.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you because it was just when you were saying people were aware of their class. My father certainly was. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and it changes a lot in the post-war period because a lot of the working class in the post-war period is being kind of treated a little bit like not a threat, right? More like a childish class that's sort of susceptible to, whatever, and kind of delinquent. So in the post-war era, a lot of the culture is petty bourgeois in the sense that it's not trying to do something grand, masterful, like in the tradition of high art, museum art, but it's doing something that's pop cultural, like the Beatles. And so it's really sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And all of these things are associated with delinquency. And this really serves the ruling class perfectly because their only worry about the working class is their children and the delinquency, the graffiti that they might do, but they're not really interested in changing the system. So you had a lot of this with the beatniks who, for example, on Ken Casey's bus, the bus wasn't going anywhere. It just said further, right? So we're just along for the ride. We're on a trip and we don't know where it's going. So this kind of like replaces the modernist utopias of the early 20th century because they had turned out to be so disastrous. And so the 60s left, the May 68 kind of, this generation of 68. They were neither Washington nor Moscow. They wanted nothing to do with capitalism and nothing to do with communism in terms of a state project. So a lot of the postmodern thinkers that we were discussing, they were on the one hand leftists, but they didn't want to be indoctrinated into what they referred to as diamat, which was this orthodox reading of dialectical materialism. And the primer on this material was written by Stalin. He wrote an essay, Historical and Dialectical Materialism, which is a perfectly good explanation of Marxist theory in a nutshell, perfect for perfect for secondary school education.
And they didn't want that because?
Well, for one thing, it's unsophisticated. And Marx is a towering figure, an intellectual figure of the 19th century. You can't understand Marx if you can't understand Hegel, and you can't understand Hegel. You try to understand Hegel, but it's very difficult, right? So German idealism is the premise for Marxist theory, which is why Marxism has nothing in common with any set of instructions, any kind of instrumental knowledge on how to get from A to Z. It's not utopian socialism. It isn't pragmatic. It isn't mechanistic because it's Hegelian in inspiration. So when
you say it's Hegelian, what do you mean? When you say it's Hegelian?
It's influenced by the ideas of Hegel, who's a German philosopher.
Which means?
It means that, the sort of, the tradition of philosophy that is before the Enlightenment is referred to sometimes as metaphysics, or naturalism in the sciences and in philosophy. So this is the Baroque era, the 1600s. In the 1700s, you have the development of the Enlightenment, which is based on a critique, right? You have the right and the ability to critique the powers that be. And, you had salons in the 18th century where enlightened despots would invite bourgeois philosophers to discuss these kinds of things.
Sort of rational thought could work things out. type of
That was the
idea.
idea, but
Yep.
from the point of view of the bourgeois thinker, not from the point of view of the enlightened despot who is merely entertaining them for the fun of it.
Right.
But I wouldn't want to overestimate rational thought, even among Enlightenment thinkers, especially if you think of people like Schiller or Immanuel Kant and Hegel. Those are three of the more sort of influential thinkers, because they're not postmodern anti-foundationalists, but at the level of philosophy, they're post-metaphysics. So what they're moving away from is the dualism that had defined thought for so long, largely due to its anchoring in religious thought. So the notion of universal moves away from this kind of St. Paul idea of, there's no Jew or Gentile, we're all God's children, we're all part of the same spiritual substance. You move away to some extent from this idea, and you move more towards this notion of subject, which is a very abstract idea. It's almost religious, but it's trying to, in a way, get away from superstition and dogma. So you have a subject of becoming, basically. In Kant's terms, it's the kingdom of ends. In other words, you have the idea that society is a project in this Rousseau social contract sense, that we can create our own destiny, that there isn't a divine providence that has already decided what that project would be. Now, you had these debates already between Catholics and Protestants to whatever extent, free will and determinism. But now this whole dichotomy is taken out of the religious realm, and it's brought into a quote unquote scientific realm. So
okay, just circling back, we're at the late 60s, and you said that they didn't want a sort of a Marxist communism, and they didn't want a capitalism. Is that right? In the late 60s? But
yeah,
they kind of got to the capitalism anyway by the time they got to the 80s. So, yep.
Yeah.
And
so just on that thought,
was that the triumph of just Thatcher and
no, this is
economists from the Chicago School and propaganda sort of
this is before Thatcher. I mean, it's almost kind of what made Thatcher in some ways possible. It became, Thatcher was possible because the left had already abandoned its revolutionary project. It had become reformist. And so the conservatives, what they did is they saw an opening. They thought, well, they're abandoning the working class. We can find a way to get them to identify, on the one hand, through patriotism. Thatcher invaded the Falkland Islands for the sake of, Iraq in the Pacific. And so that gave a lot of people this sense of make England great again, kind of empire thinking. So, that's just that's chicken feed, right? In terms of what you're getting from it. You're getting basically what W.E.B. Du Bois refers to as a psychological wage. Meanwhile, the organized labor is being decimated. Meanwhile, you're in the process of deindustrializing. You're moving in the direction of deindustrialization and globalization. But before that became kind of more concrete. But the whole, what interests me is in the post-war period, starting in the 40s and 50s, and you have this, kind of coinciding with McCarthyism, for example. I mean, you had, of course, before all that, you had basically the eradication of the organized left with the Taft-Hartley Act, with the anti-communism. Leftists had been chased out of the country, put in prison. And then at the same time, after World War II, a lot of these Nazi figures were, brought into North American and Western nations and given kind of havens. And so, you had a very deeply capitalistic, deeply anti-worker tendency. And so the problem is that the left that had supported the resistance to this and the promise of a different system, a better system, was on the one hand sidelined by Keynesianism, on the one hand, because you had what's known as les 30 glorieuses, the 30 years of post-war prosperity, where people's standard of living was increasing year by year, right? In the 50s and 60s, if you were working class, you were doing quite well. You could have a house in the suburbs, you could have a house and a car in a nuclear family, and cars were cheaper every year, right? Household goods like refrigerators were becoming cheaper every year for quite a while. So consumer culture in the West, advertising, was all about eradicating the tradition of working class thrift and self-dependence, and getting workers to buy into the fact that, if I'm a company man, my wages will go up, I'll be able to buy a car, and that's good for my family, and they'll be able to go to school, they'll be able to go to college, which I never was able to do. And so they saw that prosperity in that period. It's really with the 1970s and the economic decline that starts to be brought into question, and then the conservatives have to find a new approach in order to continue making the money that they want to make, but taking some away from welfarism, some away from wages. And so wages have stagnated effectively since that time. But at the same time, and this is what interests me as a cultural theorist, as somebody who studies art, at the same time, you have, like what I was mentioning previously with high art, like before World War II, there was low art and high art, and you had these kind of like posh spaces like museums and the opera house, and workers didn't go to those places mostly. They could have if they wanted to, because these were public institutions like public libraries, but they disidentified because they weren't seen as places for them. In the post-war period, with television, advertising, and marketing, and the baby boomer generation, which was the first generation to be advertised to directly as a youth market, you had an identification with consumerism. And so consumerism is not going to offer you avant-garde art. It's not going to offer you Brechtian theater. It's not going to offer you the most surrealist or informalist kinds of art. Those are really rare, and we only really started studying those things in the 1980s. And so what you have is a development of a petty bourgeois culture, a middle class culture, which is competing with the upper class tradition of high art and high everything. Now, if you look at it historically, you realize that even the high things were not so exclusive. But nevertheless, that is part of people's perception of high-low. So well before postmodernism tried to blur the boundaries between popular culture and high art, let's say starting in the 1980s, well before that, the culture that was dominant, hegemonic, was no longer the culture of the bourgeoisie, it was the culture of the middle class. And so the middle class in the US especially began to see itself as the definition of American culture, like as if it was universal, ignoring the difference between themselves and the working class. What the working class does is basically what we're doing. They'll do it tomorrow or in a few years.
Right.
They'll
catch up.
They'll catch up. They're late adopters. And so what the middle class becomes really good at, they become specialists at this, in terms of them being, more cultured and educated, is the creation of new social mores. In addition to, let's say, inventions in science and technology and engineering, at the level of culture, inventing new things that you can do. So, for example, you could have, instead of a nuclear family, you could have threesomes.
Yep.
You could go to orgies. You could get a hula hoop for your kids. These things are almost in the same kind of nudist beaches, Playboy magazine. They're all in the same kind of headspace of culture, which is one of the reasons I was mentioning the Barbie to you, because when Barbie first appeared in 1959, she was very racy as a doll. If you compared her to the dolls on the market at that time,
Right.
she was sexy. She was wearing a bathing suit. She wasn't a Victorian doll, which is a child, basically, which encourages the little girl, to be more like a mother towards the doll, rather than imagining herself becoming a sexual being.
So, so we've been dealing with kind of history of progression, particularly through the 1900s. So I don't know, Mark, is this a point where we want to start talking about where are we at right now? And or I'm open to you if you want to talk about some of your slides, or what do you think? Where do you want to go?
Yeah, I think if I bring in the slides, we'll be able to discuss some of the points where we are now.
Yeah. Yep.
So this has been an hour. I'm going to skip my diatribes about my books, because I had great difficulty publishing my books it's related to this public secret. And my books have become a way for people to torture me, basically, at this point, by putting typos in them, by reversing some of the things that I've said, so that when I sign off on a design PDF for publication, basically the last draft before it goes to print, I get something back that I didn't actually agree on. So this is part of the shenanigans, and also having difficulty finding publishers. So anyways, I'm going to cut that diatribe short, but
okay. For people who are only listening to the audio of this, on the screen we've got a book, Bernie Bros Gone Woke. So basically your critique of Bernie Sanders' campaign and mixing class with identity didn't work, or he didn't. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes and no. On the one hand, Bernie Sanders as an individual, his platform, his approach to issues was always the same from before 2016 through to 2020. But because of the criticism, Black Lives Matter criticism of his first campaign, and also because Hillary Clinton was referring to his campaign as Bernie Bros. These are all like these socialist white males trying to sort of like get the edge on Sanders through identity. They emphasized identity issues in the campaign of 2020, especially at the level of advertising. So the book is a little bit addressing this issue, but it does a lot of things. One of the things it talks about is the PMC, the professional managerial class. What does it want? Why does it operate this way? So some of what we were talking about is discussed here, and also the fallout of the how Bernie Sanders was pushed out of the election race. And I have this is the same book, but it's also available paperback.
And then you had another one, Too Black to Fail.
Too Black to Fail, which is a book about the Obama portraits. Every president has official portraits made before leaving office. And Obama hired two postmodern artists. The Obamas and the White House hired two postmodern artists. One is Kehinde Wiley. I was bringing this up too in relation to academic freedom. Normally when you request images as an art historian for an essay or a book, the artist will ask you for a copy of the book. They may ask you for a fee, but they will not ask you to read your manuscript and to vet your manuscript. So just in terms of academic freedom, these artists, Amy Sherald and Kehinde Wiley, refused me images of these paintings, even though they're in the collection of the National Portrait Gallery, which is a public collection. And they were paid anywhere between 300 and 500,000 a piece for each of the works. So even though they were well paid, even though these works are in public collections, I wasn't given permission to use those images because I didn't allow them to vet the manuscript as a condition for receiving those images.
Presumably that they'd done a portrait, they were had a favourable view towards the Obamas, and they knew that you were going to write a book that was not going to be favourable. Is that?
I think
could
judging
it
by
be that?
yeah, and because I'm this public figure, freak show, reality show, they probably know more about me than I would guess.
Yeah. Okay. And then there was Identity Trumps Socialism, which is a collection of essays that you edited.
Correct. And
Yep.
the subtitle was changed, but the original is The Politics of Emancipatory Universality. So that's when we talk about universality, I distinguish the universality we have, which is the universality of liberal capitalism, and the universality that is emancipatory. If you consider that liberal capitalism is a system of domination, then you would want to create a new universality, one that is better than the one we have. So that's the premise of this book. And
Yep.
the contributors to this book are leading scholars on the left. That includes, just quickly, Alain Badiou, Slavoj Žižek, Jacques Rancière, Bruno Bastilles, Barbara Foley, Vivek Chibber, Nancy Fraser, Adolph Reed, Cedric Johnson, Walter Ben Michaels, Jody Dean, and David Harvey. It doesn't get better. Nevertheless, one publisher got back to me after 6 months and said they couldn't find anyone to write peer reviews for this book.
Wow.
So
it must have been heartening at least to get those writers to agree to a book that you were organising. So that must have been some heartening moment for you.
It means I haven't been abandoned by the left entirely. So yes, it is absolutely heartening. It's a vindication of some of the suffering I've been through needlessly.
Yep. And then
but that's not what's important. I mean, what's important isn't my situation, my condition. What's important is the issues that affect all of us. And so I do want to keep the emphasis on that.
Yeah. And then your latest one is Class Struggle and Identity Politics, which fills in some of the gaps in the previous collection of essays.
Yeah, absolutely. When I worked on the previous book, I thought there were terms like terms that are in widely circulated that are being discussed that are not necessarily covered by that book. And I thought maybe I should add a glossary. But then I thought if I add a glossary and they're not discussed in the book, then what's the point? So I wrote an addendum of about 50,000 words. And then it was decided with the publisher that addendum could become a book on its own, a monograph on its own. So that's what I did with this book. And so you have in the first section a discussion of the most sort of popular concepts on the so-called woke left or postmodern left. And that would be privilege theory, intersectionality, critical race theory, decoloniality. And there's one section on identity politics proper. And then in the second section, I go through, it's the political spectrum from right to left. So you have fascism and conservatism, liberalism and neoliberalism, anarchism, postmodernism, populism, social democracy, and communism. And I look at how all of these different political tendencies don't approach the issues in the first section in the same way. They really have like a different take and a different gloss on all of these points. And so in the third section, as a Marxist, I discuss what the problems are with postmodern concepts and why ultimately these are not Marxist ideas. They will not likely advance the cause of class struggle.
I noticed in what you've sent me quite a few references to fascism, and if we can just divert to that, I guess my thinking is that when identity politics emphasises differences, then we shouldn't be surprised when people take that line and use it in a nasty way, i.e. in a sort of a fascist way, that the sort of emphasis on identity, do you think has led to a rise in fascism or has made it an easier resurgence because of this focus on identity?
Right. So, I mean, what you said and the way that you said it has um, two valences. Um, One is the critique that when we talk about identity politics, usually we're talking about the postmodern left, let's say, or new social movement left. Um, so the image disappeared. Oh,
Sorry.
okay.
Yeah, I'll put it back up when we.
Oh,
Do you need?
okay.
Did you need that to read? Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
um, so obviously, if you think of chauvinist nationalism, or white identitarianism, you could say that's an identity politics as well. But I mean, these often don't conceive of themselves as identity politics, right? Right wingers don't write. They don't work in the same field. They're not using the same ideas. They're not part of the same line of thought as identity politics. For example, if you think of the way that the Combahee River Collective defined that in 1977, or the traditions that pre-exist the Combahee River Collective. So basically, for me, identity politics is something like, let's say, feminism or women's rights. And so, you had suffragettes, first wave feminism in the late 1800s, early 1900s, second wave feminism in the 1970s. And then you have in the 1980s and 90s, third wave feminism. And third wave feminism is not in the tradition of universality, and it's not in the tradition of civil rights. Therefore, it's not part of what you could refer to as the democratic invention. So when democracy was invented, by and large, rights were reserved for propertied white males. They excluded workers, they excluded non-whites, they excluded foreigners. And so the democratic invention is the expansion of what's understood by liberal democracy over time to include issues that affect groups within society: women, racial minorities, religious groups, sexual minorities. So identity politics, this is basically the identity politics that I'm talking about. I do in the section on fascism refer to the question of this right-wing identity politics, but it's not really identity politics. Yeah, well, I mean, you could consider it a politics focused on identity. And that brings you back to classical fascism. Now, classical fascism always has a scapegoat, let's say. It could be, like if you think of World War II and Nazi Germany, who were the scapegoats? Primarily Jews, but not exclusively. So you had blacks, you had handicapped people. It was a eugenics, white, Aryan race notion. So people who were unhealthy and sick, there were ideas that we don't have to like help them. We don't have to supply medical services to these people. Intellectuals, artists, there were a lot of people who were scapegoated in Nazi Germany. It wasn't strictly speaking an identity thing, though the notion of the Aryan race in Germany, which is a bit different from what you find in Italy, was one of the myths around which you galvanized a demagogical project. But if you look at the development of fascism as an ideology, where does it come from, and what is its self-understanding? You would have to go back to the late 1800s and early 1900s in France, where many of the key figures who developed fascist ideas were coming out of the left. They were coming out of the syndicalist movement. They were all trained in Marxist theory and historical materialism. Now, they weren't necessarily very good philosophers. They weren't like Lenin or Trotsky. They weren't like, writing the best theory, but they were using these ideas, and they could communicate with regular working people with those ideas because they were perhaps somewhat already familiar with it, with the notions of class struggle, the same notions that led to the Russian Revolution, led the Soviets to choose Lenin as their leader. They understood in the Soviets what class struggle was. They understood basic Marxism. And what the fascists realized after World War I, or what the key takeaway from World War I for the fascists, was that workers would rather go to war against other workers from other nations, going against the Marxist idea, workers of the world unite, workers have no country. And instead, they would They would fight for the French bourgeoisie against the workers of Germany. And the Germans, likewise, they would work for the German bourgeoisie who are making profits off of war. So they were going to war against each other rather than organizing against their respective bourgeoisies. You have a repetition of this in identity politics. So you have conflict between men and women, gays and straights, blacks and whites, for example, and often people feeling very inspired if somebody from their group makes it into the bourgeoisie, makes it into the millionaire or the billionaire class, as though somehow that's going to lift you and lift you out of poverty, if only as a psychological wage, because that's likely all you're going to get from it. If you watch a Hollywood film, for example. So you have a conflict that ignores class. Basically, for Marxists is the fundamental contradiction between labor and capital, which is displaced onto a scapegoat. So instead of the conflict with capital, you have the conflict with workers from another country.
Yep.
And so the problem is the level of complexity is that you can never encounter the labor and capital contradiction directly. It's always mediated by other factors, many other factors. Ecology is one factor today. National differences is another factor today. So let's say the conflict between labor and capital is influenced by nationalism. So for example, American workers may or may not welcome workers coming from Latin America and Mexico into the US because the idea is that they'll be taking away our jobs or that they'll be driving down wages. So nationalism is something that in this case benefits the ruling class either way, regardless of how many immigrants are here. And very often the ruling class wants more immigrants. So the working class ends up being put in a xenophobic situation where, because they feel that they're going to bear the brunt, even if it's not true, they feel they may be the ones to bear the brunt. So they don't show class solidarity, which is what they should be doing. And so maybe they're not getting the right kind of cues from their leaders if that's the direction they're going in.
Yeah. So is one of your critiques of this movement that the left gets distracted by these issues, which is an advantage for capital because the issue of the power imbalance between capital and labour is always pushed to the side by these other fights that are confusing and distracting the issue, taking away from the root cause of the problem?
That's the $1 million question, right? That's the real question. And this is the question that is tearing the left apart right now. And because it's tearing the left apart, it's bad for society altogether. And this is basically the question that I ask myself and that I want to be able to answer as best as I can. And in the book, Identity Trumps Socialism, I have an essay that I contributed to that book. It's called The Uses and Abuses of Class Reductionism for the Left. So there are many ways that you can answer that question. And that's why if you have a definition of woke or a definition of identity politics, it really won't serve you because it's too pat. First of all, you have a whole historical development. You have many moving parts. You have a system, a process that's not complete. So it's not as though you can sort of like map out the history of what happened in the 70s and know all of the parts and put them all in the correct place. Because for one, the person doing the analysis is coming to it from a certain perspective and they're a living subject. They're in a way interacting with that history. So that history is being rewritten, as it were. But this is the question that I would want to answer. And the essay I sent you by Ellen Meiksins-Wood, she, for me, is one of the leading thinkers on this question. It's called Why Class Struggle is Central. And so the key point is that class struggle for a leftist is central to the analysis. It's not exclusive. So because you're doing class analysis, it doesn't mean that you're ignoring questions of gender and race and sexuality and nationality and religion, but it means that you're going to be thinking about these issues in relation to the development of capitalism. So in the Obama book, there's a chapter I wrote called Racialism and Its Discontents. And in that book, I propose a kind of almost abstract, ahistorical typography of different types of racialism. And so that would be people who make race politics essential rather than class politics. They would make race politics essential and central to their analysis. And so I look at different types in relation to the Obama era and afterwards. So you have race activists, race managers, race brokers. You have intellectuals who are anti-racialist, and you have the section that I developed as cultural Marxism, because cultural Marxism, and I'm not using the right-wing understanding of that term. I'm using the cultural studies version of that term, which pre-exists its appropriation by the far right. Mm-hmm. And I'm skipping this, but I was canceled by a publisher because I had a chapter on cultural Marxism, and they said that I didn't explain that it comes from the right. And why should I when it comes from the left?
Wow.
But people who are being influenced by this woke stream, they're afraid, basically, to get into the weeds on these points that are really deeply well developed in the world of postmodern and cultural theory. But it's just at this moment, at the moment of Black Lives Matter, it was as if it was a mot d'ordre. You had to center Black lives. And if you were progressive, you were doing that and you weren't questioning that. And so that really isn't my project as an intellectual. My project as an intellectual is to say, well, what does it mean to center Black lives rather than class? Is it going to help Black people if you center Black lives rather than class? My argument is that it will not. So on that level, I agree with Yasha Monk. On that level, I think if you have a gender first or a race first agenda, you're going to get in all kinds of problems. And one of the problems these days is that the problems you get into are quite amenable to the establishment, right? So you have a figure like Obama, which Yasha Monk has no problems with. And I can't understand that. How can you be a liberal and agree with a person who condones torture, agree with a person who condones banksters who make off with everybody's money, et cetera, and so on, who destroyed Libya, so it makes no sense. But this is one of the many paradoxes that we live in today. So the term that Nancy Fraser uses to define this kind of like toxic mix of identity politics with neoliberal policy, she refers to it as progressive neoliberalism, which is kind of an oxymoron. But what you have is basically Wall Street interests, Pentagon interests, the tech industry in the United States, combined with identity issues affecting women, sexual minorities, LGBTQ, IA plus, and trans issues is a hot topic these days, and race issues. So all of these things can be combined with neoliberalism in a very toxic mix. And one question we're asking ourselves these days is wokeism over? Is wokeism finished? It seemed as though it's like its heyday, let's say, was, I agree with Monk about this, was like not 2014 until about 2020, when I was writing all these books around 2019, 2020. So why has wokeism fallen out of favor is a good question. Has it fallen out of favor? One of the ways that well, we've had time to catch up with some of this and to see where it leads and to see what it offers us and what kind of damage it can do. And I'm sure many people continue to be committed to it. I gave you in the PowerPoint statistics from my association, the Universities Art Association of Canada, where you look at the topics that are discussed at conference. And
let's bring that up. Do you remember what slide number that one was?
It's pretty far down. It's around.
You can just tell me the number and I'll bring it up.
Sure. Where is it?
I think I remember seeing.
There it is. That's it there.
That's it there.
Yep.
Yep.
So these are themes that are discussed at conference by the Universities Art Association. So this is art history professors as well as studio artists like painters, sculptors, and so on. And looking at there are a few dozens, maybe 200-300 presentations at conference every year. And so I just looked at the themes that were discussed. I have breakdowns that are more subtle than this one. This is the most basic of all the breakdowns. But you see at the top there that labor and class issues are at 3.7%. Now, if you add neoliberalism and activism, you could add another 4% there. But those people talking about class are not necessarily talking about it from a leftist perspective. And if they are talking about labor, let's say, there's going to be a variety. Most likely, it's going to be a social democratic leftism. It's not going to be a socialist or Marxist communist leftism. So already there's that. But then if you look at the identity topics, race is at 54%, then nationality, diaspora, 9%, gender, 9%, LGBTQ, other identity. If you get into body politics, very likely you're still talking about race and sexuality and gender, most likely, not necessarily.
Mark, this is all from, what's the conference? It's an art conference, is it?
It's the annual conference of the Universities Art Association of Canada. In the US, the equivalent is the College Art Association. It's the official, it's the University Association of University Professors in the Arts. So that would include art history, visual studies, as well as studio arts. So the practicing artists, in addition to like art critics and theorists.
Do people not create art anymore that doesn't have some sort of underlying statement to make? Do they not create art just because it looks beautiful? Like, is everything got to have an underlying cause?
This pie chart is beautiful. I made it using Canva. So the design was made by somebody before me. But ever since the 1980s with postmodernism, in the 60s and 70s, you had a lot of what was known as neo-avant-gardists. And all of these very important figures of that period, they were all theorists. So they wrote essays that explained their work. And in that way, they bypassed criticism. So they would, instead of writing criticism, they would support each other's work. They wouldn't say this is good or bad. They would explain what they're doing. So a minimalist sculptor, for example, would have an essay. Somebody doing institutional critique would have an essay with his work. So you'd have really good work, or her work, and good writing. And so what happened in the 1980s after that is the period of theory. It was sort of like theory overboard. And a lot of art became, since the 60s and conceptual art was dematerialized. So you moved away from objects instead to situations and happenings, like hippie kind of events. And then you had a lot of artists who were trying to bypass the museum system. So you had conceptual artists who were making multiples instead of unique objects. This is on the radical side, let's say, of art. And then performance art. So like Yoko Ono was a performance artist in the avant-garde sense, and she influenced John Lennon, for example, made his work when he did his his Bed In. I don't know if you remember his Give Peace a Chance, Bed In.
No.
This would have been late
Is this like an
60s.
interview where they're lying in bed? Is that what you mean?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And it was about peace. And so
Mm.
they were doing a news conference. And so it was a form of performance art.
Ah, I thought that was just an interview. There we go. Right.
Yeah, it was an
Yep.
interview, but it also had a poster campaign, Give
Right.
Peace a Chance.
Right.
This was all over the place,
Yeah.
So that's an example of this kind of, post-museum kind of art practice. And so a lot of art today, since around 2000, is in the area of socially engaged art. So it looks more like social work, actually, than it does anything that you'd see in a museum. So it's
Mm.
artists working in collectives. They'll work with City Hall. They may work with homeless people. They may work with people needing abortion services. That's referred to as socially engaged art. But that's not necessarily what's driving all of this. And I'm saying here you've got more than 75% dedicated to identity topics. But it's a little bit more complicated because it isn't just identity. It's also moving away from any kind of left, right, and center. Well, there's never really any right-wing analysis of art anyways, but moving away from liberal and left analyses of art towards, these would be macro political tendencies, like socialist interpretations of art. So moving away from that kind of Marxism and phenomenology and structuralism and semiotics, which were all like part of the postmodern mix, towards these new tendencies like intersectionality, very trendy, decoloniality, very trendy. So if you're doing intersectionality, you can't discuss just gender, let's say, in art. You're going to want to discuss gender and race, maybe the histories of racism in a country in relation to specific artists, indigenous artists, a lot of discussion of decoloniality. So for example, on this point, if you go to the UAC, the previous website for the UAAC, it would have some writing in an indigenous language. Now I looked it up and I couldn't find which indigenous language, so I don't know if it's a mixture. I couldn't do a Google Translate. And also at conference, you'll have people, before they give their presentation, they'll do a land acknowledgement. It became very trendy to do a land acknowledgement. And so now, like, you're going to hear a land acknowledgement by about 150 people at conference. And you have to ask yourself, like, what is this? What is this about? It's very strange. I'm sure indigenous people find it very strange. And on this point, there was some requests and a little bit of pressure put on the board of the association to make a statement regarding the genocide in Gaza. So what they came up with is because there you also have a settler colonial situation. So the UAAC, when it comes to settler colonialism in Canada, they're completely, of course, against it and completely in favor of decolonialism. But when it comes to the Gaza genocide, they couldn't make a statement against Zionism, against settler colonialism. They made a statement respecting the rights of everyone to their opinion, and students. So, you get these kinds of, these for me are the problems you have when the field as such hasn't really come to terms with the limitations of postmodern theory. It hasn't understood what the attack on universalism and enlightenment and progress, notions of progress, what does it mean when you turn away from these, not accidentally, programmatically, right? And that includes liberalism and it includes socialism, both of them.
We have in Australia very common for any public event to begin with an acknowledgement of the traditional Indigenous owners, and particular tribes are often mentioned in that, and respects are paid to elders past, present and emerging. And that happens, football events, meetings of any sort. And not only at the start of the meeting, but then each individual speaker that gets up will commence with a reference to this. Very, very common. I mentioned earlier that our king and queen are in the country, and apparently at Parliament House, one of our Indigenous parliamentarians basically got up and made a scene and told him to give back the country and what the hell was he doing here, sort of thing. And people are shocked by this. And I sort of think to myself, well, how can you on the one hand be fully accepting of these sort of acknowledgements of country, and then be shocked when one of these people then, comes out and says to the king, not happy with your colonial project. And people would just double standards, I guess, in that sense, not acknowledging the contradiction inherent in observing these niceties all the time, but then inviting the king who represents the complete opposite and expecting people to remain silent about it. There's
a slightly different case in Canada. I'm not a specialist on the question, so I don't want to say the wrong thing, but I've heard Indigenous scholars do the opposite in the case of Canada, saying that hunting and fishing rights were guaranteed by the Queen. And so in that case, they're quite happy to acknowledge the monarchy,
right,
which isn't necessarily recognized by contemporary governments.
Yeah.
So, it can vary, but Canada can do you one much better. In 2023, in September or October, I don't remember the date, the entire Canadian House of Commons rose up and applauded a Ukrainian Canadian member of the Waffen SS, the Galicia division in Ukraine. And of course, Canada is involved with Ukraine and NATO against Russia at this moment, mostly in Ukraine. So obviously that's the reason for it. And then there was a little bit of a scandal, barely a scandal. And it's, kind of makes sense because the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, is someone who has a family background associated with this Ukrainian Nazi past that she has renounced to some extent, but she's also held up signs that say Slava Ukraini, which is a right-wing term in Ukraine that is associated with the Banderists and so on. So she hasn't fully separated herself from it. And then the question was, did the Trudeau government know who this man was? They claimed afterwards that they didn't, but clearly they did. And so that's kind of an interesting sort of basically a Trump moment in Canadian politics, because what they said before the parliamentarians got up and applauded was that this man fought against the Russians in World War II. And so after that, they all got up and applauded. I guess they don't know.
The Russians were on our side.
They were. And,
Yes.
And they liberated Europe
Yes.
at the expense of about 20 million Russians.
Yeah. It's that sort of gaslighting, isn't it? Okay, let's get back. I mean, we've got all the time in the world, but I am sort of wanting to gear it towards some. Where do we go from here if we are saying that the left has made big mistakes and is continuing to make those mistakes? How does it turn around in a direction you think would be good?
Yeah, could we go to the slides again?
Yeah,
And go backwards a little bit?
Go backwards, yeah.
I'm interested in this question, obviously, but I think you can't really talk about the future if you don't talk about the past.
Yep.
Oh, right, this one here.
That one, yep.
And the present, right? Because if we don't know where we are, we need to have what Frederick Jameson, a Marxist scholar, referred to as cognitive mapping, right? We need to have a big picture of what's happening in the world and where we are, and on that basis, we might be able to move forward. But if we misrecognize where we are, we're going to have a lot of I really kind of, I'm always annoyed with this. Let's have a national conversation about race, right? On the Oprah Winfrey show or something. And so the question is, why do we have to begin at zero every time we have a national conversation, or worse? Like, why do we have to begin at -10? Now, there's a need for that simply in terms of basic pedagogy. Basic pedagogy, you have to not presume that the people you're addressing know what you know or know very much about the topic. So the idea is to, help people, come to a sense of where to start with some of these and maybe where to go. However, when you get to university, it's a completely different game. When you get to graduate school, MA programs, PhD programs, there it's a very different game as well, because there you're really creating the leadership class when it comes to the middle class and the professional managerial class of the future. And so this is where, you're going to have what you might refer to as window dressing, like, all of these woke topics. And then you're going to want to know, well, is there something behind it? Like, is this really a class agenda that is, presented as an identity agenda? And this is what a lot of people would tell you. For example, Adolf Reed, they'll say that the culture war is a class war, right? And it's a class war against the working class. So how do you understand that? And you'll have very sophisticated identitarians and diversitarians and racialists who will oppose this vehemently. And they may have good grounds to do so. Indigenous people may have good grounds to do so. And so you need to hear those arguments. And you can't always in some ways, address them exactly on the same terms. So this is where you get what's known as theoretical noise, right? Like ideology clash. But one of the things that has inspired my work, when I stopped teaching around 2006, it was interesting because at that point I was sort of compelled by the need to offer courses to students to discuss new ideas. But when I stopped teaching in 2006, I can kind of just focus on what I want to do. Like, what I find interesting for a research project. And so one of the things I wanted to do is get back to thinking about class and class analysis in relation to art and culture, which had been pretty much bankrupted to the extent that the only kind of Marxism that you had with the postmodern left was what's known as cultural Marxism, for good or bad. That term is a term you could apply, a cultural studies approach, in other words. So this is one of the things I came up with, which is a combination of the ideas of two different people. One is Peter Berger, who's a theorist of the avant-gardes, the historical avant-gardes. And the other is a sociologist, French sociologist called Pierre Bourdieu. Both are very well known, one in art history, the other one in sociology. And what I did is I combined their ideas. So what you see as the fourth section of this graph is not in Peter Berger. The first three, the graph itself and the first three parts were invented by Berger. And the fourth one is what I gleaned from Bourdieu that I added to Berger's analysis. So he's interested in how art has changed over time, how we understand art and the way that it's made. So in the first section, you would have sacral art. So the Middle Ages through to about the Renaissance and even earlier dynasties, like let's say in China. In the Baroque period, starting with the Renaissance, you have classical courtly art. And it isn't the same kind of art. One of the reasons it's not is because much of the older art was made for religious purposes. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, a painting or a sculpture that's in a cathedral is made as a cult object. It isn't made as a work of art.
There were a lot of images of the Virgin Mary and that sort of thing. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, exactly. Or even the church itself. Mm. the Gothic cathedrals, let's say, or Romanesque cathedrals, and the mosaics, let's say, in a Byzantine or Eastern Orthodox church. So with the Renaissance and the Baroque period, which is this next section here, you have people like Louis XIV, who's a humanist, right? He's influenced by Renaissance humanism. He's going back to the age of the ancient Greeks when it comes to sculpture. So he's doing things like Michelangelo was doing, which is basically naked human bodies, in the Sistine Chapel. You would never have seen this in the Middle Ages because it was sinful. But with Renaissance humanism, you have this reinvestment in antiquity and pagan themes. And basically the achievement in terms of art on this kind of humanistic level, which celebrates the artist as almost a divine figure like Michelangelo or Raphael or Leonardo. And so, and these are also sponsored by the court, but they have a more secular orientation. And you have the development of academies. So the artist is no longer working in a medieval guild. The artist is now working or being taught in an academy, and you're really looking for the best artists, and so the courts of Europe will be competing between themselves to see who can attract the best artists. And if they have something like this, then we want something like this. And of course, that continues today with museum competition and biennales. That shifts around 1800 when you have basically the end of the feudal era, the beginning of the liberal, democratic, bourgeois era. So you're moving away from academies that were sponsored by the monarchy, let's say like Shakespeare, who was one of the king's players, kingsmen, working for the queen and not doing anything that would offend the queen or the monarchy. So then you have the bourgeois period. So the patron is no longer the monarchy, it's no longer the church, it's the average middle class person, and they want paintings for their home. So these are basically commodities. They're no longer cult objects. They're no longer objects that you find in the palace of a king. They're everyday objects in a sense, and they're on a commodity market. Now, there were markets for art before this time, but what changes is that the artist is no longer thinking about what they're doing in terms of, something that is oriented towards the academy and the kind of training and the kind of criticism you find in those places. And they become, in a way, detached, much as the Gothic novelists like Mary Shelley or Byron, the authors of vampire and Frankenstein novels in the early 1800s, or Charles Baudelaire, the poète maudit. These were all what you can consider the spoiled brat children of the bourgeoisie. So they were all romantic, they didn't believe in superstition, and they quite enjoyed insulting society. They quite enjoyed insulting the bourgeoisie with their philistinistic materialist values. The bourgeois are oriented more towards making money and justifying that need to make money in terms of the wealth of nations in capitalist liberal terms. But the children who are culturalized or they don't have to be children, they can simply be, on their own. They're thinking more in terms of individualism, which comes out of the Kantian definition of art and a little bit the Hegelian definition of art. And as the 19th century becomes more informed by Marxism and socialism and anarchism, they more decidedly turn against the bourgeoisie. And so they become radicalized, and this is what's known as the Bohemian era and the Bohemian avant-gardes. So all of the art movements we study, like Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, they're all doing radical art that changes every 5 years, and it doesn't look like anything the academies are doing, which is considered this kind of, very expensive for nothing bourgeois stuff. So you'll get a figure like Van Gogh, who comes out of that moment that we still today identify as avant-garde and making art that's autonomous. He's not even making his art for the market. The market's not interested in Van Gogh. They won't buy. Nobody will buy his paintings. His brother is, pulling his hair out trying to find buyers for his crazy brother's crazy paintings. but he thinks they're good. He thinks they'll be maybe recognized later on. So
Well, his
that's kind
brother
of,
was an art dealer of some sort, I think. Is that right? I
yeah,
think so. He
exactly.
had some sort of expert eye for these things.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a logic to what Van Gogh's doing. And if you're following Impressionism, you see how they're breaking down they're making their brushwork visible. It's not about the subject matter, it's about the form and the treatment and the color. So if you take those concepts, it's easy to understand Van Gogh. It's simply what would have been considered shocking at that time, because it had this whole idea that art should innovate and that it should do something different every decade was a new phenomenon at that time. Today, it's so cliche that no artist would even think to talk about their work in that way. A postmodern artist has nothing to do with that. So this is the autonomous idea of art for art's sake, basically. And that leads into end of the century decadence. You have the decadence movement. A lot of these artists who are symbolists, for example, they go back to representation, but with all these weird themes, these kind of like strange mystical themes that the bourgeoisie loves to indulge. So if you see the film Moulin Rouge, for example, this is kind of like that period where the bourgeoisie is going to the Moulin Rouge and hanging out with these bohemian artists, maybe smoking opium and living a kind of offbeat lifestyle away from the wife and kids. And so, that kind of continues through to around the post-war period, to about the 1940s and 50s. Then you have a shift to what I'm describing as the moment at which the petty bourgeoisie gains cultural ascendancy. So, you could think of popular culture in a way as petty bourgeois. You have mass culture on the one hand, which isn't the same thing exactly as middle class culture. So the petty bourgeoisie is more likely to be familiar with classical novels, for example. They may like classical music, but they may not have the time or the interest in reading a lot of novels or in going to the concert. And so they might be looking for an easy version of these ideas. And so you get a kind of cultural watering down, where on the one hand, the working class has more access to culture. And on the other hand, the upper class has the same culture as everyone else. They have this kind of popular culture, mid-cult. And so that's why postmodern ideas are so popular, because everything these days is kind of in the middle. Nobody wants to be, nobody wants to be confused with somebody who thinks they're avant-garde or that they're like a master artist, or so all these things you learn in college to not reproduce. So we have a situation today where culture is networked through social media. It's culture industry in the traditional sense. Culture is not an autonomous art; it's an industry. And there's government grants for art, there's biennales, there's museums. It's a system, and it includes universities. And people in these industries are like workers. Some of them succeed, some of them become blue chip artists, but that's only about 2%. The majority will not. They're like people who want to be basketball players in the NBA. Only a few will make it. The majority will not be known. The majority won't make it. And they'll get jobs at a lower level, let's say working in a museum or something like this. And so they may choose to organize in an artist union. They may choose to collectivize in some way in order to have representation with the government. But they're not living from their work. They're living from another job, and they'll make their work in their spare time, most likely. But also at the level of ideas, in the mode of consumption, the mode of consumption has changed. I refer to this as post-Enlightenment. It's not only that today's culture rejects the Enlightenment, the notion that we're moving towards progress, the faith that we're moving towards progress. There's a lot of despair in the 20th century with fascism and Stalinism and with the culture industry that makes it seem as though these are all systems of domination, these ideologies, and these industries, they're really systems of domination. And so, you know, where do you go if not in this traditional avant-garde Van Gogh direction? You don't really want to go in that direction. You want to not repeat the same things that have led us to this moment. And so at the level of the middle class, the professional managerial class, the way I understand it is you have a conflict. You have what I refer to as a conflict between two factions of the same middle class. On the one hand, the creative class, basically the educated, apolitical faction who identify with progressive neoliberalism. They think Obama was a good president. They think Clinton would have been a good representative because she's a woman. They're basically kind of in the tradition of what you might consider a yuppie or a hipster. So for example, many of these people are against the genocide in Gaza because it's a clear case of human rights abuse and criminality. It's deemed a genocide by the ICC and the ICJ. They don't have a problem with it. But then you ask them about what's happening with NATO vis-a-vis Russia and China. You ask them about the 500,000 people who've died in Ukraine, and they don't have an opinion. Mm-hmm. There are no protests for what's happening over there. It's almost as though because Putin is so anti-gay, he's so regressive and reactionary that it's okay to be against Russia. It's good to be against Russia. And the goal is to decolonize it. So to basically take a federation and to divide it into smaller nations. So that's NATO's plan. And a lot of the creative class is, I think, lacking in wherewithal when it comes to some of these kinds of points. Basically, they're interested in what puts butter on the bread. And then against this, you have an activist class in the PMC. So this activist class is more the people in the tradition of the 60s student movement who understand these kind of geopolitical problems, the problem of imperialism, of neocolonialism, but also very oriented to identity issues at the same time. So they want to combine all of these things in, what you can think of as an intersectional combination. So a lot of the colleagues I've had who are in socially engaged art, for example, I came up with this graph in 2008. So I've been on this class critique of identity politics since that time. But at that time, when I was writing my essays, no one was offended by any of my work. In fact, I was being asked to contribute to projects and so on. And it's only around 2016, after Black Lives Matter and after this kind of like great awakening, as it's known, and this cancel culture phenomenon, that I started getting the cold shoulder. I started getting, more aggressive kinds of responses and so on and so forth. So I haven't changed my tune, but the culture has changed. Now it could be that things will change again. But so here you have the petty bourgeoisie.
So you just described two versions of the creator class or the managerial professional class. One that understood Palestinian Gaza as a genocide, but didn't see sort of understand Ukraine very well, and one that did, but both of them still shackled by identity issues. Is that
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
The main difference is that, let's say, the creative class, the hipster faction, the yuppie faction, they understand identity issues in this very kind of selfish kind of like yuppie notion of advancement. So it goes along with entrepreneurialism. It goes along with, let's say, black capitalism, lean-in feminism, red capitalism, this kind of thing. And also these very woke kind of films and topics, let's say. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I wrote the book on the Obama portraits is in 2009 when they came out, or whatever, 17. No, is it 17? What was Obama's last year? 2016, right?
Yeah, we had Trump for 4 years, and we've just had Biden for four. So it would have been
Exactly.
at the
Right. So
end of
sorry,
2016 was
brain
the
lapse.
Obama's finished.
Right. And
Yep.
so after his two terms, after doing like all of the terrible things he did, I was reading articles in this racialist BLM sense that were, very laudatory, and I couldn't understand it. How can people writing for Hyperallergic and other websites be so like forgetful so soon? And it was because, after a film like Black Panther came out, I don't know if you know this film, Black Panther. It was the first Marvel, is it Marvel Comics? It was the first Marvel Comics superhero film with a lead black figure,
Hmm.
Black Panther. And so it was kind of like this, finally we've arrived, finally in terms of Hollywood and in terms of like the presidency, black issues are on the table. But I mean, for the majority of working class black people, it's not really an advantage. In fact, it's quite the opposite, because Obama oversaw, at that point, it's now been superseded, but at that point, Obama had overseen the largest transfer of wealth from the working class to the billionaire class in human history. So these things are kind of like symbolic achievements more than anything else. I'm not discrediting them. I'm not saying they don't have significance, but I'm just saying don't be bamboozled, uh, by this culture. And so, what was your question again?
Well, I was really like, where do we go to from here? Is where I was, you know, wanting to
Yeah.
get to. Is there a way of fixing the left to bring it back to class issues as a central concern, and
Mhm.
capital and labour, and understanding that, and spending more time on that than on class issues? Is there a way that that can happen? Um, Perhaps
Yeah.
as people see more and more, a key goal of identity politics is representation. We want more black women in power, for example. But you see cases where, a daughter of an immigrant becomes the immigration minister in the UK and then wants to send illegal aliens to Rwanda. Or you see women get into position of power but then want to institute policies that are very anti-women. And Obama gets into power and, looks after Wall Street, not Main Street. So I see that we're going to be just disappointed by a lot of minority people in power, that people might begin to understand, you know what, just getting one of these people in power isn't enough. They have to be there with the right ideology in their head to actually change things for the better. So maybe if enough of that happens, people will say, okay, we've got representation, but we still have a problem. It's more an ideology change that needs to happen here. I don't know.
Yeah. The thing is, one of the things is the left has an advantage in terms of numbers, but the right has an advantage in terms of capital. They
Mm.
have, with the billionaire class, a lot more money than we
Yep.
do at the moment. And so they can influence a lot of media, especially mainstream media. And so if you bring that back to the PMC, the middle class, what I'm arguing is that, I mean, Ellen Meikson's Wood, her work's very good, because what she was saying is that these identity topics, one of the problems with them is that they obscure these class issues.
Mm.
David Harvey has said the same thing. David Harvey's a Marxist geographer who wrote one of the first books on postmodernism, one of the first critiques of postmodernism, and Fred Jameson wrote one in 1984. So the Marxist critique of postmodernism goes back to the early 80s. And a person who influenced me, Henri Lefebvre, a French Marxist philosopher, he was criticizing people like Foucault Derrida, who influenced Spivak, Lyotard. He was criticizing these French thinkers as they were coming out, as their books were coming out in French back in the 60s and 70s. So there's been Marxist criticism of postmodern ideas as long as there have been postmodern ideas. In academia, especially in the United States, less so in the UK. In academia, the Marxist critique was kind of waylaid to a certain extent. And by the 1990s, you didn't hear about it much anymore. And if you think of people like Harvey and Jameson, there was a feminist feeding frenzy against these two guys. And Mike Davis, for being reductionist, for having a kind of naive understanding of reality, which itself was kind of a flawed argument, but it was coming from feminist psychoanalysis, and it was coming from post-structuralism. And so all of the fancy doodads that you can want from academia, you can use those to dismantle and deconstruct the Marxist left, which was in some ways viewed as this kind of white male preserve. And so that didn't really shift until after the 2000s. And so with Black Lives Matter and the Women's March and Me Too around 2014, all the postmodernism came rushing back, and Hollywood has jumped on it, for example, like going after Polanski. Polanski, we hadn't heard about his rape case, for many years. But then lo and behold, he's become public enemy number one on the Me Too radar, along with Woody Allen.
So, Mark, when does it change? Does the left just keep doing what it's doing?
Well,
or how will it change, or when will it change?
What I want to address is the liberal class has a need for this view of the working class as being unsophisticated. And so they need that, because you're going to want to teach them courses, right, at the undergraduate level. So you have to think that I've got something to offer these unwashed worker type people who are like masturbating to porn too much, which is, we're not going to get to it, but that's kind of like one of the themes in the Barbie movie. Ken when he tries to recreate Ken World or whatever it is to take over Barbie World, he's kind of coming from this working class, pornscape universe, right? And that's kind of like the way the film introduces a class element into the film without addressing it directly. So the liberal class has a need to see the working class as on the end of their pedagogical imperative. And that pedagogical imperative can change every season with new directions like intersectionality and decoloniality. You're always going to have the edge as the middle class, because you're constantly changing the things that are problematic and the ways of going about it. And there's a whole sort of social media feeding frenzy where people are prosumers. They're creating the content. The platforms are reaping the benefits, but every person gets to create content. So if you're being interpolated, not at the level of solidarity, but at the level of allyship, then you have something special that you can bring to Twitter. You have something special that you can bring to Facebook, which is yourself, right? Your embodiment.
So you're saying the incentives are working against the professional class in educating up and coming.
In favor of the professional class,
Yep.
insofar as they think of themselves as a class in itself and not a class for a new social project.
Yeah, but working against them from providing a class critique, and so they're incentivized not to provide the sort of thinking that you're providing.
Yes,
that's not in their interests.
They're incentivized to avoid class analysis to a large extent. I mean, that's why I had a lot of problems. I couldn't finish my PhD thesis on this ground. But ignoring that.
So should we be pessimistic? Should we just be...
It's worse than that. It's worse than that. Because if you want to have a class analysis in addition to these other issues, which are all important issues. There's a myriad of methods: radical democracy, left populism, autonomous Marxism, intersectionality. There's tons of ways that you can include class that are not Marxist. In fact, they're anti-Marxist. In fact, they're part of the reactionary anti-Enlightenment tradition. And so I refer to this as micro-fascism. It's micropolitics that has a culture war, fascistic, anti-universalist, anti-human rights dimension, but it's completely legitimate if you think of it in terms of empowerment, if you think of it in terms of discourse theory, which is premised on Nietzschean nihilism and will to power. And so all of this kind of subjectivism gets legitimized through theory. And so this is a complicated academic series of layers that makes it so that people who are on the activist wing, let's say the diversity, DEI mandating shifts to departments and universities, they're legitimized. And not only that, but I find it's odd that they don't see the contradiction between what they're doing and what's happening with, let's say, the charge of anti-Semitism, because this kind of like Zionist anti-Semitism is the apex of wokeism, I would say, and so one might hope that this would enlighten some people as to its limitations, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. And
okay, I guess that was my question. It is, and you've answered it there, is you just don't see it happening anytime soon. We're sort of,
because you have such zaniness on the far right, right? We have far right movements popping up all over the place. We have one in Canada with Poilievre. And can you imagine Trump, the person who tried to coup his own country, up for election again? And then if you legitimately go after him with an impeachment attempt or with court cases, you have people on the left in the DSA. This is the left in the US, the DSA, who are criticizing lawfare against Trump. It's like, if you can't use lawfare against a fascist who tried to coup his own country, I mean,
Yes, they say this has never been done before, and the answer is, well, nobody's ever done what he's done before. That's why it's unique.
Or he doesn't really mean it, or he's not really a fascist, because he was just recently at a Catholic church fundraiser, accompanied by people from the Democratic Party, and they're in the same. And he used to be a Democrat, so arguably the billionaire class, the moneyed class, all of this fascism. It's just a different kind of window dressing. It's just a different form of symbolic culture war type nonsense. And so I think a lot of people don't realize the threat of these far right movements. But the point is there's a saying that goes, every fascism is a failed revolution.
Right.
And so what we're seeing is not only a left that is programmatically non-revolutionary, right? They don't want to talk revolution. That's the old left. So ever since World War II, we've been new left. And so we don't even have revolutionary theory on the table. If you talk about Antonio Gramsci, who was a leading intellectual in the Italian Communist Party, he invented the notion of hegemony, concept of hegemony. And he said, the revolution worked in Russia for very specific reasons, because they had to do their own anti-feudal revolution. They hadn't gotten rid of their monarchy at that point. So really the communist revolution was kind of like their bourgeois revolution in a way. And but the same thing, the communist revolution, can't happen in a European country that is more developed, where people are more educated, and where the working class by and large gets by a little bit better and a bit more easily. They're more likely to be tempted, either if they're not conservative, like the problem with the south of Italy at that time. In the north of Italy, where there's a lot of workers and they're unionized, they're not going to be revolutionary. They're going to be tempted by social democracy. And so basically what you see in the US with the United Auto Workers and with unions like the Teamsters identifying with the Trump Republicans, the Metal Workers Union identifying with the Trump Republicans. You have the American Federation of Teachers identifying with the regime in Kiev, which is a far-right regime. The UAW, the same. So basically what they're presenting American workers is what's known as corporatism, where the social democratic left, the unionized left, is the left wing of the neoliberal agenda. And so it's not surprising that, you know, when it comes to the DSA, they're saying class, 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 but their main representative, AOC, she's a member of the DSA, they should have kicked her out a long time ago, but because she's going along with these genocides and these NATO World War III plans, and this, you know, failed Biden administration where nothing was done for healthcare, for student debt, for infrastructure. It's one failure after another. She's towing the line. So this is the best that the DNC has in terms of a representative, not at the local level, but at this major ideological level. Why didn't they dump her? They should have dumped her a long time ago. So, you know, they're trying to sort of maintain this sort of like, we're not going to achieve anything with revolutionary sectarianism. We have to stay within the mainstream. We have to operate, you know, on terms that are not of our choosing. And so it's always this kind of, it's always this game of kind of positioning, which is a very middle class or aspirational middle class kind of rhetoric, which is very good because you can have all the social criticism in the world. You can be the best and the brightest when it comes to social criticism, but really when it comes down to it, your function, your structure in the system is to maintain the middle class as a kind of de facto intellectual cultural establishment, which is basically working against the working class because you're working against the radical left programmatically.
Mark, I want to head to winding up. So did you have anything key idea that you wanted to get across that we've missed so far? Was there any one thing that you feel that we just didn't get to that you would like to, or flag for a discussion at another time?
Could we look at some of my cartoons just before we go?
Yeah, yep. So
one of the things that I lament, if we can go forward.
Yep.
One of the things I lament is that there isn't a lot of good cultural production of films. I was canceled for this cartoon by a publisher. There aren't a lot of good films that are addressing the contradictions and the problems with these issues we're discussing. I don't know very many. If you look at a film from the 60s, I think it is, called Putney Swope, very good film by Robert Downey Sr. It's you could use that film to criticize Ibram Kendi and his mismanagement of his well-founded school at Boston University. $20 million, I think, sort of completely wasted. Or I don't know the specifics, but something like this. You have, we can go forward a little bit.
Yep.
You have the film American Fiction, which is about a black writer. And they won't let him write his books unless he makes them more sort of street, so he ends up calling his book Fuck, because that will sell. Whereas, something more subtle won't do as well. But, I know a few examples, but I don't know very many. So, once in a while, I just tinker around with memes that I put on the internet, hoping that they'll maybe make someone think and laugh. And so moving on again, I just want to show a few from my Ken Lum series, which are named after a Vancouver artist called Ken Lum, who made photo conceptual art. And I thought these would be kind of interesting as PMC types like today's PMC types. Just kind of.
What do you mean by PMC?
Well, there's a tradition in if you can go forward, PMC is professional managerial class.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
So these kind of contradictions between the kind of activist and the creative sectors of the PMC. Just a few more.
Yep.
Yeah. So this is, this was about kids, LGBTQ constituencies being referred to as children. It's one of my pet peeves, but we'll just skip it.
Keep going.
Yes, please.
So we're looking for cartoons. Is that what we're looking for?
Well,
I'll just keep going till you tell me to stop.
They're kind of like editorial cartoons,
Right.
but they're not actually cartoons. They're more. Okay, so this one here is I'll do the forwarding.
Yeah. Okay.
So this one here is this was by Ken Lum. So he's a photo conceptual artist from Vancouver, and this is an example of what he does. So he has a photograph with text. So this is in the Vancouver School of Art, like Ian Wallace and Jeff Wall, for example. I can't really describe it to you, but this is the inspiration. And so I did a kind of poor man's Ken Lum. And these are real works. Is this advancing?
It just delays about 4 or 5 seconds, I think. So it should do. We'll just, if
Or
not,
if you want to,
I'll do it then.
yeah. Can you advance one, please?
Yep.
So, Ken Lum's, these are real pieces. They're quite large and they're in museums. So if you wanted to glue your hands to them or throw tomato soup on them, you could do that. I'm not suggesting you should, but I'm saying you could. Whereas the things that I do, they're just digital. They're only online. So one more.
Yep. There we go. One more from that.
One more from that.
Yep. It was. Yep. It's happening.
And one more.
Yep.
And one more.
Okay.
So what comes after this is what I refer to as my Ken Lumpen series. In other words, the middle class as a lumpen middle class, the lumpen petty bourgeoisie, borrowing a phrase from a term from Marxism, lumpen proletariat. So this person, she's saying, I'm a specialist in diversity and sensitivity training. I work for DNAology.com on how to market the notion of hybridity and flexible identity in ways that do not offend specific groups of people. There are many problems in the world, but one of them is that people don't know who they are or what they want. That gives our products and services an advantage on retailers, hardware stores, and travel agencies, since what we offer goes to the core of a consumer's sense of self.
Right. Okay. Next one.
Yes, please.
Yep. I think because the thing was so large, it
could be the 14-hour time delay.
Yeah, but it should be.
So this young woman says, I'm homeless now because my parents can't afford my rent. It's hard to keep my laptop charged to finish coursework. I'm not against the privilege theory and whiteness studies I'm learning in social science class, but I don't think that because I consider capitalism to be a more determining factor in social life than heteropatriarchy, that I'm socially conservative. I can do without some of the people in my classes. They can go fuck themselves.
The problem is, though, Mark, nobody's got an attention span or a vocabulary to persevere with this, do they?
This is how a person might feel in a situation of distress, where on the one hand, you're being taught. So the previous image, when I posted it on my blog, shortly after, or almost the same day or the day after, a book proposal to a publisher, a leftist publisher, was refused. And in my paranoid universe, when I'm canceled or refused something, it could be because of something I said or something I did. So I was trying to imagine, who is this person who saw the previous cartoon and didn't didn't accept my book for publication because I said they can go fuck themselves. Anyway, so this guy, he's a publisher, he's a commissioning editor, and he says, it's true, I do very well as a course instructor and publisher of books, even if sometimes I get called a trot and a tanky. Basically, I see my work as managing a plurality of interests and constituencies into something that approximates a leftist social movement. The days of armed struggle are over, and I think that the revolution is confronting our traumas about race and sexuality. Human rights are overrated.
And this is, you're saying that this is just a common person that's in the PMC class,
well,
in the PMC.
Well, these are types. These are people who are, sort of dealing with this creative class lifestyle class structure. They're in the middle class, but they're also dealing with these activism issues. So I'm a left-wing freelance journalist. It's a tough market, and the best way to survive is to cover all the bases and avoid making enemies. This business is basically game theory applied to your social and work life, which means that Cold War liberalism is still the name of the game. I've decided to settle for social democracy and intersectionality so that I can pay my rent. So if you think of Yascha Mounk, because I just read his book, a lot of what he's proposing, if you think of his discussion of prisoner's dilemma, for example, he's basically advocating that we use things like game theory and prisoner's dilemma, these very formal paradigms, to think our way out of wokeism. And so this is, an example of somebody who would be doing just that, but maybe not in the way that one might hope.
I mean, that one does have a point, though. One of our problems is that if you're a journalist who wants to promote ideas that are not approved of by the owner of the media organisation, then you just won't have a job for much longer. So people are forced to sort of toe a line, and if they're not independently wealthy, they just have to toe a line that comes down from above, don't they? It's difficult for journalists to go against the grain.
Well, I would take that as a compliment.
So, Mark, I am conscious of sort of trying to wrap this up. So,
could we do just
this
one more? No, not the next one.
Next one, okay, yep.
I think this the one after the next one, because I think that's my best one.
Next one.
Yeah. Oh no, not that one. The next one.
Okay. So not this one. Next one. Yep. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if this one's gay or not gay. He might be gay. I have a PhD in gender studies, but what I work in now is a new fifth wave feminism field called critical comedy studies, which is also known as revenge studies. Most comedy pretends to quote unquote tell it like it is. But what an intersectional approach reveals, regardless of your standpoint, is that most comedy is a form of epistemic violence. Although comedy is impossible to escape, and you wouldn't want to live in a society that takes itself too seriously, only socialized forms of punishment are able to bring about equality. We're working with the campus Human Resources Department to root out jokes.
The new left has no sense of humour. Is that what we're saying, Mark?
It has its own form of humor, and some of it involves torturing people.
Yeah. All right, Mark. Well, I do need to wind this up. So, we've covered a fair bit, I think. I'll have some links in the show notes. And we do chapters with this podcast, so people listening to the audio would have been able to see some of the images on their app as they're listening to the audio podcast. So that's good. So, well, Mark, good luck with your writings and your work.
Could we ask, do we have any questions in the chat, or is that?
No, that's all we've got is just what's on the right there. So nothing.
Okay, well, hello to Dawn,
Yep.
Tuvi, Allison, Cordis, James, Leanne, and Don Tuvey.
Yes. Thank you for watching in the chat. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, Mark, that was something different, and your knowledge on these things is encyclopedic, that's for sure. So thank you for that. I'll have links in the show notes for some of your stuff so people can see what you're up to. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Trevor. It's my pleasure.
No worries. Okay, everyone, we'll be back next week with the usual panel discussion.